Hello, Top Fan Rivalry followers. It's Bill. It's Mike. We got episode 3 of the first season of Unraveling the Red Sox. Mike, how you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. It's a nice rainy day here in mid-January, and we're excited to talk baseball.
I wish it was a rainy day, man. It looks like it's gonna be. We actually, this is gonna surprise you, but we actually have some friends coming over with their kids tomorrow. Are you ready for this?
You're going swimming in a pool.
To hit the pool. That's right, because we've had overcast and drizzly rain all like drizzly weather all week. But no,
Well,
now this, yeah,
nothing cuts through the sludge of January like talking about baseball. So,
exactly. So what Mike and I thought we would give a whirl for on these is obviously the first 5 episodes are in the locker or in on YouTube. Then we go into the locker room. We'll have discount codes for you. Everything will be great there. But what we thought we'd do is we've kind of unraveled the Red Sox already. We thought this week we'd go 80s, next week we go 90s, and then the following week we go 2000s to the present. Maybe go a little extra on that one. Uh, but just have a good time talking about that. And then by then, spring training will have started. We'll talk about the team. We'll talk about how the Red Sox are going to win the division, whatever it might be, right? So I've got some statistics for you, Mike, that might surprise you before you get started in the 80s. Here you
all
go.
right,
The Red Sox finished first twice in those 10 years, 86 and 88. They
which is a
finished
better feat, which
what,
is a better feat than sounds because
exactly.
we're in two divisions still,
Yeah, there were
or
two
at this
divisions,
point, we're not
seven
three. So,
teams,
yeah.
seven teams per division. It was crazy.
It's a
They
much bigger dogfight.
Yep, they finished third twice, fourth twice, and fifth 3 times. Their overall record in the 80s was 100. It was 801 and 742. They had a number, and to your point, 89 and 73 in 1982, and they finished third. They were 15 games, 16 games above 500 and finished in third. That's insane. 10 games over 500 in 1984 and finished in fourth. Now, that was the year the Tigers won the World Series. They won 104 games. They started off 35 and 5. So, yeah, that's a little, different there. They finished, uh, let's see, 83 and 77 in 1980, which is still a pretty good feat. You would think in today's world, that's wild card. No, they finished in fourth. So,
Yeah.
pretty crazy. So talk to me a little bit about the 80s, my friend.
Well, the 80s was a crazy time.
Yeah,
Uh,
and cut.
right? I was born in 1983. So through the 80s, I was 7 years old.
Okay.
Um, point Probably 0.01% of 7-year olds you have uh keyed in watching baseball on a regular basis for a full season. So I probably really didn't get into the Red Sox and into baseball until the 90s. But growing up again in Boston, you are uh, inundated with the history of the team. So I think I could probably talk pretty well on the Red Sox in the 80s. I remember the names of some of their bigger players, or who I at the time thought were bigger players, but um, very similarly, I think, to kind of how uh, the culture of America was transitioning in the 80s. So were the Red Sox. Very transitional decade for the team. They went from, uh, you know, a pretty, I mean, the Red Sox are a legendary franchise, uh, you know, no matter what year, no matter what decade it is. But you definitely have like some down times, and I think in the 80s you had some down times for sure with the Red Sox.
Well, and
Uh
you mentioned it perfectly, and I'm sorry to interrupt you. You mentioned it perfectly
No,
though.
no,
So, you said it was harder back then because there was 14 teams in each division in your league, right?
right,
Or the American League had 14 teams and the National League had 14 teams in it. You
right.
had 7 teams in your division. You had Detroit, Baltimore, New York. I mean, you had some very difficult teams, and I know Baltimore doesn't sound big or Detroit because of their current
That time they
situation,
were.
but they were huge back then.
Yeah.
So, it's like that Yogi Berra documentary that's on Netflix where Jeter tells Yogi, "Hey Yogi, it's more difficult because we have more series this time. So you winning like 9 rings is like really winning five." And Yogi's response to Jeter, "If you want to come over and count them, you can."
Yeah, right.
But it was a
Yeah,
lot.
you had to play against more. You had more competition just to make it, just for the opportunities. So,
Yeah, it was
um,
much more difficult back then.
yeah. In the '80s, though, you have the emergence of a lot of Red Sox legendary players. You have Wade Boggs. You
Mhm.
have Roger Clemens making uh his rookie, appearance, and uh his first 20K game, which is the first time in baseball history that happens.
Yep.
20 strikeouts. You have I don't know if I want to get ahead of ourselves here, but you have both the best thing to happen to the Red Sox in the '80s and the worst thing to happen to the Red Sox in the '80s, and it's the same exact thing.
It's the same exact
Yeah,
year.
yes,
Dave Henderson's home run and jumping up like he's dunking a baseball, and then it gets by Buckner,
right,
which we talked about last week. We talked about the feel good moment and
right.
bringing Billy Bucks back. Um, you know, most folks don't realize how good Bill Buckner really was. Um, but he is also like his knees were bad and should have never been played in that inning. But as you know, he may be a candidate for a guy that stayed 1 or 2 years too long in
Yep, and that
Major
that
League
that
Baseball.
definitely happens.
Yeah. Um,
That happens in sport across the way, and you end up tarnishing your kind of
well,
your reputation and your legacy by doing that. It only takes one moment.
and what people don't realize, right, is that when you're this tall, you realize that you have a gift. And all throughout elementary school, junior high school, little league, high school, college, you're told you're the best.
Yeah,
So what happens when your physical body can't do it anymore? Even though your mental body is ready to compete more, how do you take your physical body and say, "Hey, come on, giddy up, let's go," when it really doesn't happen that way? And so a lot of people, aka you mentioned Roger Clemens, there are people that just don't know how to retire. And I've never competed at that level. I know what it was like for me in college to realize that I could no longer compete. I mean, I was depressed for probably 2 or 3 weeks because for
oh yeah,
me, there's nothing like grabbing a baseball, going on a mound, staring at a guy that has a weapon 60 feet 6 inches away from me, and deciding how I'm going to show him that I'm going to beat him,
right.
and he's going to show me how he's going to beat me. To me, the smell of the air, the the mound rubber underneath my cleats, just the physical side of it was just amazing. But when I realized that it was time to be done, that's hard. And I was
It's
in
hard.
my early
It's not
20s in
easy to
college.
accept for sure.
These guys play, some of these guys play 20 years in the show. How do you how do you stop something that you started when you were age 3 and now you're 43? You've done 40 years of your life. Mm,
You don't know what else to do, a lot of the time.
yeah. How do you stop it? It's yeah. Anyways, it's tough. Um,
Right?
the Red Sox had some players, like you say, Jim Rice.
Jim Rice, yep.
Okay. They had Dewey, right? Wade
Yep.
Boggs.
Yep.
Um,
I
you guys
mean,
had some players that were household names, and I know that you remember This Week in Baseball, right?
sure.
The TV show Saturday mornings.
Yep.
If you don't
Saturday
remember that,
morning.
then we got to stop the show. We're done, everybody now.
No, I
But
remember This Week in Baseball.
the but you remember This Week in Baseball, and I got to tell you, a West Coast guy always heard about the Red Sox. You guys were you guys, even though you won two division titles out of 10, which that's really good. Go back and look in history, right? I mean, how many times do you have a run like the Yankees had, or the Braves had, or even for that matter, the Dodgers are having? It's not often. It's not often. And it wasn't against seven teams. Now it's against five. So,
Right.
um, can you give me two or three Red Sox memories that you have from the 80s?
Oh, geez. Um, from the eight, I mean, well, obviously the '86 World Series and all that stuff we kind of already touched on. Uh, and the 20K Reds. I think I used all my bullets right off the bat, Bill.
Ah, that's okay. That's okay. It's Friday morning. It's
Right.
Friday morning.
Let's
So
see. Well, I'll give you a uh memory of the Red Sox. That's not necessarily the Boston team, but you have the longest game in baseball history featuring the Red Sox organization in the 80s against um, Baltimore. I forget what their franchise was at that point, but you had Boggs and you had Ripken playing in that game. I think in 81.
yeah, we'll have to look it up, but yeah, yeah. Let's Where's my top fan stats guy? I got to get him
Right.
on these things. When you start pounding out that, it gets all kinds of crazy, right?
Right. Yep. April 18th, 1981. The Rochester Red Wings versus the Pawtucket Red Sox. 33 innings.
Jeez.
So let's
Like you get
extrapolate that out. That is almost four full games of 9 inning ball.
Yeah, you got what you paid for there.
Right? They
And
stopped the game. They
those seats
stopped the
were
game and
probably $4 or
restarted it.
$5, maybe, right?
Yeah. In Pawtucket, sure.
Well, they're probably $4 or $5 now. Uh,
Yeah, right.
uh, no, that's amazing. No, one of the things that I like,
Over 8 hours of playing time. That's crazy.
that's like a work day,
Yeah.
like a work day. I have to tell you, in the 80s, I'll tell you a funny story. It had to do with the Angels. It did not have to do with the Red Sox, but it's funny that you mentioned what you just did. My dad had gotten ticket, and listen. We lived 15 minutes from Anaheim Stadium. We lived an hour from Dodger Stadium. Dodger fan, but my stepdad was an Angels fan. He had gotten free tickets. Asked my mom if I can go. I'll never forget this. It was a Thursday night game, and my mom said no. He has school the next day, and I could hear them arguing about, well, the next day's Friday. It's not blah 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 yada yada yada. And on some Fridays, we got out of school at like noon, right? It was like once a month or some stupid thing like that. So my mom goes off to go to work, and my dad takes me to the game. My mom was working in retail at the time. My dad worked in worked a refinery job. Comes home from work, takes a quick shower, takes me to the game. I thought mom had said no. She actually had. The game went in. The game went into extra innings, right? And if I can
Uh,
remember correctly, it was like 13 or 14 innings, and we didn't have the clock to like speed up in between innings, so we didn't get home till close to midnight, right? And I'm past, right? I wake up the next morning and see, and I didn't understand this. I do now. I wake up the next morning and I come out to the living room, and my dad's sleeping on the sleeping on the couch. And I thought, wow, dad must have just fallen asleep watching TV. Well, fast forward a bazillion years later, being married for a few years, I know what that meant. Like
yep.
he took a bullet for the team there, but
This is the doghouse.
he did not want, to not go to the game. And we got a single through the shortstop third baseman by Don Baylor to win the game. I'll never forget it. Never forget it. So There you go. There's your 80s extra inning story that my poor dad took a bullet for the team on that one.
Always extras.
Yeah, always extras. So the Red Sox teams were very good in the 80s. Again, if you look at their record, I looked at the 80s Dodgers record, and the 80s Dodgers, obviously they won two World Series, but when I was doing this with somebody else and we were doing some research on it, the Dodgers were only 40 games over 500 for the entire decade and had several losing seasons. The Red
Wow.
Sox had one season where they were 500, which was 1985. They had only one season, 1987, where they were under 500, and they were 78 and 84. Now, 1981 was a strike year.
Yep.
So but the Red Sox at the time were 59 and 49. They were 10 games over 500. Are you ready for this? They finished in fifth place, 10 games over 500. That's how competitive the division was, people, back then. You're 10 games over 500, um, 110 games into it, you got a shot to win the division. No, 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 not this division.
Yep. No,
So,
it was
um,
tough. You
yes.
had a lot of good teams. A lot of teams were constructed kind of the same way. You had a lot of like really good baseball players, like uh, so so as you know, like I'm a baseball card guy, and if you look at the pictures of the guys on the baseball cards in the '80s, they looked like men.
Yeah.
If you look at pictures of baseball cards on players today, they look like little boys.
Yes. Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
know if that's me being older and younger, but I mean it holds true, So you have it was a different you were a different makeup uh
Yes.
back in the
100%.
80s.
100%. It was literally you looked at the 80s, the guys were unshaven, they got the beards or the mustaches or the goatees. They're wearing the satin, right? The
Yeah.
pullovers or something like that. And they literally, half of them look like people that you didn't want your kid to even go near, much less
Oh yeah.
get into a
Yeah.
car with.
Guys in their 20s looked like they were in their 40s.
Yeah, exactly. And nowadays they almost look like they're wearing three-piece suits. Is everybody? I mean, you
Yeah.
know, I remember guys like Gorman Thomas. You know, I remember guys like him hearing stories that he pulls his truck up into the now, mind you, they didn't make the kind of cash that they make now. I'd have to look at
Right.
the league minimums, but
That's part
I,
of it too. That it was more of a you're more of a lunch pill kind of
mhm,
guy,
yeah.
than you are today with the millions of dollars in contracts and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I remember hearing stories of Gorman Thomas pulling into Milwaukee, getting out of his truck, smoking a cigarette, going into the locker room and pounding three or four beers, and then going out and playing. I mean, guys were just a little different back then, right?
Right. Yep.
So, I'm looking
Just
up.
scrolling back through some of the players, we haven't mentioned that Yaz was still on the team in the early '80s.
Hmm.
Obviously, he was headed towards the end of his career, but Eckersley with his first stint, before he takes Dave and Carney and they head and go make Red Sox West in Oakland, uh, and take that franchise, to what they were in the late '80s or become part of it.
So,
It's
are you ready for
definitely
this?
fun to scroll back through and see.
See some of the
You know,
names: Jim Rice,
yeah,
like you said, Wade Boggs,
right. You have
Yastrzemski.
some of the you have the big names from the '70s
Mhm.
start to fade away. Like I said, Yaz and Fred Lynn goes out to California. Carlton Fisk goes to Chicago. Uh, those players that were synonymous with the Red Sox in the '70s. It changes over in the '80s.
Yeah, and It's funny because when I was impressionable when I was impressionable, just like when we get into the 90s next week, you're gonna nail it because
Oh,
that's
sure.
when you were impressionable. I was impressionable in the 80s. I was born in the mid 70s. And
Yeah.
Freddie Lynn, I didn't know until gosh, when I started looking up baseball stats in the 90s that Freddie Lynn was a Red Sox. Because I always equated him as a California Angel. His home run that he hit in the All-Star game, running around the bases with his fist up. Like to me, he was always an Angel. He was never a Red Sox. But then you look up what he did, and his numbers were better as a Red Sox than they were as an Angel. But
Yeah.
again, to me, he was always an Angel. Um, Here's something interesting that you might get a kick out of. The league minimum in 1980 was $30,000. Okay. The league minimum today is $750,000.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, in 1981, they increased it to 32,500. After the strike, they increased it to 33,500. And in 1983, it was increased to 35,000. Okay. Now, to give you, that's the league minimum. To give you an idea of what that looks like. Okay. Um, my dad, as a architect, and I found his pay slip. He was making really, really good money, and we weren't struggling at all. And he was making $32,000 a year as an architect. So now there's no architect that's just starting out or in the middle of their career that's making a three-quarters of $1 million.
Right.
Like if they are, I'm switching my career.
Yeah.
Um, But to give you an idea money wise, now we'll take, you mentioned Wade Boggs. So we'll take Wade Boggs for a second and we'll go down and we'll look and see in 1984 when they um, brought it up to 35,000, I think is what I said. 1984, Wade Boggs made $525,000 with the Boston Red Sox. Now, that's good money now. But considering that you could buy a single family home with a nice yard, um, you know, 2,000 square foot home, decent home for about 40, eh, probably about in California at the time, probably about $80,000.
And that's also a top prospect on his rookie contract
Yep,
in
yep,
84.
yep, yep. And so if you switch that around and we'll
See
bring
what
in a name.
Devers' salary in 2019 was.
Yeah. So we bring in Rod Carew, who's a Hall of Famer, right? Who's not there. In 1984, he made $800,000. So it gives you an idea economics wise how things have
Right.
changed. Right.
Yep. The economics completely different, which is, you know, all a part of what we know about the game back then and what we see in today's game too, the differences.
Yeah. And I was at a high A game last season and I watched a ball get hit to left field and the left fielder had an outside chance to get it. Like I'm watching it because it's kind of going down, but it's kind of breaking left. And he's coming in at an angle. He's left-handed. So it was a smart move for him. And he's running as hard as he can and he slides to get it. But when he kind of dove and slid, he landed on his right shoulder and separated his shoulder. Okay.
Oh,
Had to come out of the game. And I felt bad for him because that could potentially be the end of his career. But what I thought about was that's 80s baseball. Because again, if you're making $100,000, you're trying to keep that $100,000. That's big money back then, right?
right.
Whereas now the league minimum is $750,000. The the league minimum is more than $70,000 a month, Mike. So what do you care, right? If you can play in the MLB for 5 years or 7 years, you're making 70,000 a month. Go buy yourself a nice house, pay it off real quick, and in 5 years retire if you want
You're
to. Like, and you can go buy your own, you know, you
Whatever
can be
you
in
want.
Boston and start a hitting school or whatever and make tons of
Yeah.
cash and say, hey, you can be Sam Malone. Go start your own bar. Cheers. Everybody knows your name.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
but it's a different mentality. It's a different feel, isn't it?
Yeah. It really is. I don't want to say that they care less because I don't think that that's what it is. Uh, but there's just a different intensity,
Yeah,
and I think
that's a good
that's a
way to
big
put
one.
it.
Right.
That's a good
Yeah.
way to put it. I mean, think about it. Think about it for a second. Think about your economic situation. And let's rewind the clock and let's make you 22 years old. Okay. You still have a wife, you still have a kid, you have the same economic situation. Think about it for a second. You're 22 years old, you get a signing bonus of a $500,000. Okay. You make it up into the show, you're 25, right? You're on your rookie contract, and you're making $1 million a year for the first 3 years. Now you're 28 years old, and you're going to sign a 5-year deal, which is going to pay you 5 million a year. Okay, think about that for a second. In the last 10 years, you've made, you
Upwards of
know,
10 million.
you've made 30 or
Oh,
40 million dollars.
yeah. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
are you are you struggling? No. If you get kicked out of the game, if you were smart, you bought yourself like would $30 million in the next 10 years change your economic situation?
I don't even know if that's a question.
Yes, it was rhetorical.
Right.
Oh man, but you get it. You understand. I mean,
Yeah.
it's crazy stupid what these guys and you're right, the intensity has not changed. It has not changed whatsoever. But the economics of the game have changed, which can change how people play the game, right?
Right.
And so, well, yeah. So 80s Boston we covered. Now you were super young then, so
Super
for me,
young. I remember my favorite player in the 80s was Gator. Mike Greenwell was my favorite Red
nice,
Sox.
nice.
Uh, and he was
Left-handed
in,
stick.
he came up in the late 80s, which is, I saw more towards the end of his career, but I just, he was the guy that, we kind of, that was like the big young star in the late 80s. And then we have our sentimental, Jerry Remy was a Red Sox and a player in the 80s, and then of course he becomes the voice of the Red Sox and the personality for the Red Sox, through the 2000s. So
You guys had
uh
Calvin Schiraldi. You guys had, you know, it,
Alvin.
I'll tell you right now. You know what were the cool jerseys? If you were gonna buy a jersey, okay, if you were gonna buy a jersey in the 80s, okay, Dodgers were a cool jersey, because you had all kinds of celebrities wearing them because they're out here in LA.
Sure.
Um, the Oakland A's were a cool jersey because of the Bash Brothers.
Yeah.
The Red Sox were a cool jersey because they were always playing pretty well. And then you had New Edition and New Kids on the Block that were always wearing Red Sox jerseys,
Yeah.
right? So those were, and then the Yankees jersey. So the Red Sox were like the jersey to
Part of the
wear. Like,
pop culture. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
they people wanted to wear the Red Sox jerseys. And so, it works out well. It works out well. So, Mike, next week when we do 90s, that's your jam right there, isn't it?
Yeah, I like to think so. Excited to talk about the emergence of guys like Mo Vaughn and Nomar,
Nama.
and Trot comes in the 90s. So
Ooh, you're getting me all
plus
tingling.
plus
I like
plus
this.
some other names that I'll wait for to bring out next week. But
But by the way, folks, Manny Ramirez in the 90s was known better as a Cleveland Indian than he was a Red Sox.
yes, he was. Yeah,
Just so that you know, the Indians had a dominant team in the 90s. And
sure. till they
Manny
met.
and Jim Thome were there. So if he doesn't mention Manny next week all that much or just as a passing thought, don't kill the guy. Manny wasn't a big deal
I
then.
always mention Manny. Manny is like 1B with Pedroia.
There you go.
So just real quick, so I didn't fall out of love with Manny like a lot of Red Sox fans did when at the end of his Red Sox career.
Mhm,
I wasn't living in Boston, so I wasn't inundated with uh, the media hate for Manny
mhm.
at the end of his career. So I never soured on Manny. I always and will always hold a place in my heart for the Manny being Manny shtick, and just how much fun he was as a player.
The
But
player.
we'll probably get more into that in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Uh, but when we get
Yeah.
into the 2000s, but
You mentioned Trot Nixon, you mentioned Nama, you mentioned like a lot of these guys you're talking about now. Those were my high school years. Those were like, and for those of you that don't know, we'll talk about this next week. I feel like we're just jumping into our show for next week, but those of you that don't know, for probably 3, maybe 4 years, and that doesn't sound like a long time, but in baseball, that's like a fourth of somebody's career, possibly. There was always an argument who was going to be the starting shortstop for
in the
the
All
American
Star
League
game,
at the All-Star
yeah,
game. It was either
yep.
Noma, A-Rod, who played for the Mariners
Seattle
at the
or
time,
Texas, yeah.
and Jeter. And so, I mean, it gets nuts. Mike, did we do a good enough job today covering it?
I think so. I mean, I think we did all that we could for the Red Sox in the '80s. I think that we pulled a couple strings, started to really get to the nuts and bolts and unravel what was going on in Boston during the '80s.
In Boston. So, well, Mike, let's do it again next week. Everybody, next week is the 90s. Don't miss the 90s. We'll give you a show. As you can tell, Mike and I will make you laugh a little bit too. We'll come up with a couple of funnies in there. But
Oh
enjoy
yeah.
your Friday. Everybody have a safe weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Have a great week.